The safest places often breed the most comfortable predators. Clifton, Virginia, 1970. It was a town shielded by affluence, old oak trees, and a collective illusion of absolute security. It was not a place where you locked your doors. But behavioral science dictates that idyllic geography doesn't deter a psychopath. It merely provides a meticulously curated hunting ground. On a quiet afternoon, 10-year-old Patricia Ann Moore was walking down Clifton Road. No alarms were raised. No witnesses came forward. There was just a sudden, violent subtraction from reality. When a child is abducted in broad daylight within a tight-knit community, criminal profilers understand one chilling truth. They are not hunting a transient drifter. They are looking for a ghost who already lives there. This requires an offender who understands the precise rhythms of the neighborhood. Someone who has been watching, quietly escalating, feeding a dark cognitive distortion until the internal fantasy demanded a physical victim. 3 months later, the devastating end stage of that fantasy was unearthed in the nearby woods. To a behavioral analyst, a disposal site is never random. It is a psychological fingerprint, a geographic extension of the killer's need for comfort, control, and familiarity. For over 5 decades, the unknown subject, the unsub, has evaded the justice system. But the behavioral footprint remains. Today, we dissect the psychology of the phantom who shattered the community, proving that the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the shadows. They hide in plain sight, smiling at you from across the street. Victimology is the fundamental cornerstone of behavioral profiling. To understand the architect of a crime, we must first deconstruct the target. Patricia Ann Moore was 10 years old. In the lexicon of threat assessment, she was a definitively low-risk victim. She did not engage in transient behavior. She did not frequent dangerous areas, and she was securely anchored within a protective family structure. When a low-risk victim is successfully abducted from a low-risk environment, especially in broad daylight, it immediately eliminates a significant percentage of the criminal population. It tells the behavioral analyst that we are dealing with a highly organized, highly motivated offender. This was not a crime of sudden, chaotic impulse. It was the culmination of a psychological evolution. Behavioral escalation dictates that an offender capable of this level of precision does not simply manifest overnight. There is always a preamble. The timeline of this unsub did not begin on the day Patricia vanished. It began years prior, likely rooted in a developmental history marked by specific trauma patterns or profound feelings of inadequacy. To compensate, the offender develops a rich, violent internal fantasy life. Over time, fantasy is no longer sufficient. The cognitive distortion demands physical enactment. Before 1970, this individual was likely practicing. In the quiet neighborhoods of Clifton, this might have looked like peeping, trespassing, or the unexplained disappearance of neighborhood pets. These precursor crimes are often dismissed by small communities as juvenile mischief. To a profiler, they are the vital rehearsals of an emerging predator. When Patricia walked down Clifton Road, she was navigating her daily routine. The unsub, however, was hunting. The geography of a small town acts as a psychological buffer for a local offender. They know the ingress and egress routes. They know the blind spots where the canopy of trees obscures the line of sight from nearby windows. The swiftness of Patricia's disappearance suggests the offender did not use a blitz-style physical attack, which would have generated noise, a struggle, and potential witnesses. Instead, behavioral evidence strongly points to a con. The Unsub leveraged something far more effective than brute force: familiarity or perceived authority. A neighbor asking for help finding a lost dog. A familiar face offering a ride. By manipulating the social contract of a trusting community, the offender bypassed the child's natural defenses. The abduction was silent, efficient, and horrifyingly mundane in its execution. Once the abduction was complete, the psychological dynamic of the town fundamentally shifted. As hours turned into dusk, and dusk into the agonizing first night, Clifton mobilized. Search parties formed. Flashlights cut through the dense Virginia woods. It is a documented phenomenon in criminal profiling that organized offenders often harbor a deep-seated need for control and superiority. They feed on the cognitive distortion that they are smarter than law enforcement and the community at large. Because of this, they rarely flee the jurisdiction after the initial crime. Fleeing implies fear. Remaining implies dominance. As the frantic parents and neighbors combed the tree lines, calling Patricia's name into the darkness, the behavioral profile suggests a chilling probability. The Unsub did not retreat to the shadows. He likely injected himself directly into the epicenter of the crisis. He may have poured coffee for the volunteers. He may have offered words of comfort to the Moore family. He may have even held a flashlight, walking shoulder to shoulder with the very people hunting him. Searching the exact woods where he knew, with absolute certainty, they would find nothing. The psychological payoff for the offender had begun. He was no longer a powerless individual. He was the secret architect of an entire town's terror. But while the initial abduction demonstrated pathological control, the disposal of the remains 3 months later would reveal the true depth of his dark motivation, leaving a behavioral footprint that investigators are still decoding 50 years later. For exactly 90 days, the town of Clifton existed in a psychological purgatory. The initial adrenaline of the search had metabolized into a slow, suffocating dread. From a behavioral standpoint, this specific window of time, the period between the abduction and the discovery of the victim, is incredibly revealing about the offender's mental state. During these 3 months, the Unsub entered what profilers call the cooling-off period. The intense, localized anxiety of the actual crime subsided, replaced by a psychological downregulation. The offender returns to his superficial baseline. He goes to work. He mows his lawn. He engages in mundane conversations at the local grocery store. But internally, he is actively feeding on the community's terror. The missing posters plastered on every telephone pole are not pleas for help to him. They are trophies. They are public validations of his absolute control over the environment. Then, the illusion shattered completely. 3 months after Patricia vanished, her skeletal remains were discovered in a densely wooded area just outside the immediate residential boundary of Clifton. To a homicide detective, a body is a crime scene. To a criminal profiler, the disposal site is an autobiographical statement. It is the final, physical manifestation of the killer's psychological narrative. Forensic pathology might tell you how a victim died, but the geography of the disposal site tells you how the killer lived. Geographic profiling relies on the principle of the buffer zone. Offenders, particularly those who are highly organized and operating within their own communities, rarely dispose of victims directly adjacent to their own homes or workplaces. They create a calculated distance to insulate themselves from the investigation. However, they also rarely travel into completely unfamiliar territory, as the risk of being stopped by law enforcement or getting lost in an uncontrolled environment spikes their anxiety. The woods where Patricia was found were a perfect psychological compromise. The location was remote enough to delay discovery, yet familiar enough that the killer could navigate it confidently, likely at night, without drawing attention. This indicates a profound localized spatial awareness. The unsub did not need a map. He knew the terrain, the soil, the tree cover, and the isolation of that specific patch of woods. It was his comfort zone. Furthermore, the condition of the site itself speaks volumes about the offender's relationship to the crime. There are generally two types of disposal: concealment and display. A killer who poses or displays a victim is often acting out a complex sadistic fantasy, wanting to shock the person who finds the body. A killer who conceals the victim, burying them, covering them with brush, or hiding them deep off the trail, is demonstrating a high degree of forensic awareness and a desperate need for self-preservation. In Patricia's case, the prolonged concealment over 3 months points heavily toward an offender whose primary motivation was to evade detection rather than to make a public spectacle. The violence was instrumental. It served the purpose of the internal fantasy, and once that fantasy was fulfilled, the victim was discarded as evidence that needed to be erased. This brings us to one of the darkest concepts in behavioral analysis: the process of depersonalization. To commit a crime of this magnitude against a child from one's own community, the offender must cognitive short-circuit his own empathy. He cannot view the victim as a human being with a family, a future, and a name. The victim becomes an object, a prop required to satiate a dark motivation. The way the remains were left in the elements, exposed to the harsh Virginia winter, underscores a complete psychological detachment. Once the event was over, the unsub felt no remorse, only the cold mechanical need to separate himself from the consequence. The discovery fundamentally rewired the psychology of Clifton. The ambiguity of missing was replaced by the terrifying certainty of murdered. But the behavioral profile that emerged from the woods delivered an even heavier blow. The meticulous nature of the abduction, the calculated use of the buffer zone, and the sheer discipline required to remain silent for 3 months confirmed the investigators' worst fears. This was not a mistake made by a transient drifter. This was the work of a highly functioning predator who understood the town's vulnerabilities intimately. As the police tape cordoned off the woods, a chilling realization settled over the residents. The monster wasn't a stranger passing through. The behavioral evidence practically guaranteed that the killer was someone who belonged there. someone who had likely watched the police process the scene from a safe distance, secure in the knowledge that his mask of normalcy was entirely intact. There is a pervasive myth in popular culture regarding the uncaptured murderer. It is the romanticized idea that a killer, having committed a horrific act, will eventually be consumed by the crushing weight of their own conscience. Hollywood dictates that they will descend into paranoia, driven mad by the ghost of their victim, ultimately making a fatal mistake that leads to their capture. Behavioral science tells a completely different, far more terrifying story. When analyzing a cold case that has spanned over 50 years, like the murder of Patricia Ann Moore, profilers must examine the psychology of the successful psychopath. The unsub who abducted and killed Patricia did not spend the subsequent decades looking over his shoulder. He survived precisely because he possesses a psychological mechanism known as profound compartmentalization. For the organized psychopathic offender, the murder is not a haunting trauma. It is an event. It is a locked box in the architecture of their mind. Once the intense psychological need that drove the 1970 crime was satiated, and once the immediate threat of capture passed after the disposal of the body, the offender simply closed the box. He returned to his baseline state of existence. This is the chilling reality of the long, cold case. While the victim's family in the town of Clifton remained frozen in a state of perpetual, agonizing grief, the killer moved forward. He likely married. He may have had children. He built a career, attended neighborhood barbecues, and paid his taxes. He assimilated seamlessly into the very fabric of the society he had deeply violated. To a behavioral analyst reviewing the decades of dusty files and dead-end leads, the focus shifts to how this specific type of offender ages. The assumption that a killer will inevitably strike again is biologically and psychologically flawed. While some predators are driven by compulsions that force them into a continuous cycle of violence, others are opportunistic or driven by specific temporary stressors. Furthermore, as an offender ages, biological factors come into play. A natural decrease in testosterone and physical vitality often leads to a phenomenon known as criminal burnout. The physical act of abduction and murder becomes too risky, too exhausting. However, the underlying dark triad traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, do not disappear. They merely adapt. The aging unsub likely transitioned his need for control and dominance into more socially acceptable, non-lethal avenues. He might have become a domineering patriarch, a manipulative boss, or a pillar of the community who secretly revels in his hidden, monstrous past. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, investigators interviewed dozens of local men. Some were prime suspects who ultimately slipped through the cracks. When modern profilers look back at these original interrogations, they aren't looking for confessions. They are looking for the behavioral leakage that original detectives might have missed. They look for the inconsistencies of normalcy. They search the transcripts for the man who was overly helpful during the initial search, only to quietly move away to another state 2 years later when the heat refused to die down. They look for the suspect who displayed a chilling lack of emotional affect when shown a picture of Patricia, focusing instead on the logistical details of the police timeline. They look for the man who possessed the superficial charm required to lure a child, coupled with the glib, manipulative language required to deflect a detective's suspicion. But as the years turned into decades, a new psychological phenomenon took root in Clifton: institutionalized trauma. The unsolved murder became a permanent structural component of the town's identity. Generations of children who were not even born in 1970 were raised with the inherited anxiety of the Clifton Road phantom. Parents unconsciously tightened their grips on their children's hands. The geographic space where Patricia was taken remained an invisible, psychological scar on the landscape. This is the ultimate, silent victory of the organized psychopath. He did not just end a single life. He altered the psychological trajectory of an entire zip code. As we approach the present day, the statistical probability of the unsub still being alive dwindles with every passing year. The man who hunted in the woods of Virginia in 1970 would now be in his late 70s, 80s, or perhaps already in the ground. This introduces the final, most bitter pill that behavioral analysts and victims' families must swallow in a half-century-old cold case. What happens to justice when the monster simply dies of old age in his own bed, surrounded by a family who never knew the predator living behind his eyes? The behavioral profile of the Clifton Road killer is complete, but the cage remains empty. Criminal psychology can dissect the monster, map his environment, and lay bare his cognitive distortions, but it cannot reverse the brutal flow of time. The most terrifying reality of the Patricia Ann Moore case is not simply that a predator hunted in a place of perceived absolute safety. It is the enduring psychological stamina of the unknown subject. For over 5 decades, the unsub maintained the perfect mask of sanity. He proved the most haunting axiom of behavioral science: the most dangerous offenders do not look like monsters. They look exactly like us. Patricia's legacy is a permanent psychological shift in this Virginia town. A quiet stretch of road where the memory of a 10-year-old girl still lingers, while the shadow of her killer has blended seamlessly into the American landscape. Behavioral analysis has given us the precise shape of the shadow, but the man casting it has slipped into the dark, likely taking his secrets to the grave. Until the silence is broken, Clifton remains a psychological crime scene, frozen forever in 1970.